So welcome back to the channel. It's the Rhetoric Feud as usual, and we're back for a normal video and not one of those skits and rants like last time. So we're going to be going over a very quick video, maybe 5 to 10 minutes long, unlike the previous style. I'm trying to do rapid fire because I realize that a lot of times that I am rambling. So let's get right into it. Today we're going to be discussing why the patriarchy existed in the past and why it doesn't now, and explanations and advice for people who are advocating for either side in this issue. So we're going to go through a both historical and a economic perspective on why it existed and why it doesn't now. So to begin, I'm going to first start by talking about religion, right? Religion is one of the main social institutions and the social institutions that has been the most innovative throughout history because of how central it is, right? So sociologists and anthropologists alike have found that throughout human history, and psychologists too, that a very important part of the human psyche is the spiritual element. This is going to be in service to something greater than themselves, right? Whether it means that they're going to have a monotheistic religion, or they have religions that explains certain things in life, or in like China's case, an overpowering or an overbearing government. Humans have this innate need to have this kind of social structure that brings them together, because that is what innately gives humans their power, right? If we didn't have this innate urge to socialize with other human beings and cooperate under a given story, then we wouldn't be very successful at all, as we're not as powerful as other animals. So based on this, fact, we're going to go into the fact why religion is going to be something very important. So we've all heard of Darwinism, right? We've all heard of Darwinistic selection and natural selection. And that also applies for not only individuals in a species and a species as a whole, but also species to species and institution to institution. This is my belief, and also something that makes sense intuitively, I believe. But religions and social institutions, including governments, that didn't work out well, or didn't have good policy, or made bad choices in the past, right? We're talking like thousands and thousands of years ago, they died out because the neighboring nation or the neighboring tribe, which did that thing better, would outcompete them either population-wise or by war. For example, if you didn't adopt iron, but I did, I would easily wipe out your whole village and take your women, children, and your men as slaves. Right? That was how it worked out back then, and therefore the best innovations happened in a sort of non-genetic evolution, which made humans, develop so quickly. So that's all the background you really need to know for this argument, because you need to understand how societies and social institutions function and how they developed over time. And one of the biggest things that you need to realize is that almost all religions today, or at least like the monotheistic religions or the Abrahamic ones, right, which do dominate like the western half of the world, and then of course there's a whole different argument for the East. But all religions and social institutions of some kind had to drive childbirth, right? And I guess to a certain degree, the bureaucracies in the East mirror this because they had their own ways of encouraging childbirth and having, a more collective society. So let's get right into this. So all religions today, or social institutions of the past that lasted till today, lasted because they had institutions, or certain parts of their institutions, or their or their cultures, I guess, that encouraged childbirth. And this is really important. First, before we get into like the whole feminism thing and the patriarchy, let's explain why this is important to have higher birth rates. So economically, you have a generation, right? Especially in places with social welfare, or at least any sort of reverence for the elderly, which most societies do. You have the younger people providing for themselves and their family, but also the elderly above them, the generation previous. And then they do that in the hopes of their children being the same, right? I hope to make money to support my parents, and I also hope that my children will make money and support me once I am of a retiree age, right? And that's how it's always been, because, you don't want to let your old people just die, because that's just, bad. And you need to make money for yourself to have children as well. So therefore, you need a lot of children, or else you're not going to have enough people to, like, support them, right? For example, if my parents have, like, 4 kids, including me, which isn't real, right? Then they have 4 people to support 2 of them. Whereas they would have less money if they had 3 people to support 2 of them, right? Or less output, right? Less goods. But then if I have, 1 kid, that's only 1 person to support me and my partner, right? And then also my parents, should they still be alive, right? Should my parents have grandkids, right? And so it is really economically important for your young people to have kids, or at least maintain a replacement rate birth rate, which means that 2.1 births per woman, your population is neither decreasing or increasing depending on your mortality rate. Right, like, you want your population generation by generation to maybe increase a little bit, but at the very least, stay somewhat similar. And what happens if you don't have that is when the generations get smaller and smaller following, what happens is that the smallest generation at the very bottom is going to be overtaxed or overburdened as you need to support bigger generations in the past, whereas their generation is much smaller. This leads to social inequality, perhaps revolution once living conditions get that bad, but basically you don't want it to happen, right? That's the TLDR. And that is why it's important. If you look in the past, right, infant mortality was a big issue. Infant mortality meaning that the amount of children that died from age 0 to 5 is usually the metric used. And basically it's saying that if you have like 10 kids, right, depending on your the time of history, but this is like 1935 in the United States of America, maybe like 77 of them would die if you had 10 kids. Depending on your economic status, what infrastructure or medicine you had access to, that would obviously be different on a case-by-case basis. But the fact was, especially in the pre-modern world, you're going to have a lot of kids dying at an early age. This means that if you want to have 3 kids, you can't only have 3 pregnancies. You're going to need a lot more, right? You're going to need 6, 7, 8, or 9, or you're going to need more to actually support yourselves and so your children can have success as well. And also because back in the day, more children often translated better economically because it's a labor-based, 90% peasantry society, right? Whereas today, if you have 4 kids, who knows if all 4 are going to get white-collar jobs and working in like Wall Street making a lot of money, right? But back in the day, if you had 4 kids, they're definitely going to work on your farm and they're definitely going to do like, I don't know, like blacksmithing or whatever your trade or profession is. Therefore, it made more sense economically for societies to encourage higher birth rates. And this is where that whole Darwinistic thing we talked about, the Darwinistic thing we talked about comes in here, right? Because if you have societies that encourage higher birth rates, they're going to, as I said, be more economically successful as they have more field hands and they have more ways to support their society, their elderly, and themselves. Whereas a society that doesn't encourage birth rates is going to get outcompeted and overrun, or at least lose out, culturally or militarily, to a society that has more soldiers, better fed soldiers, better technology, better social cohesion because their elderly people are not dying in the streets, right? You have all these good things that come apart, and therefore, I believe, and as is currently understood, because of this sort of like social Darwinism that happens when it comes to civilizations and the choices they make, you're going to find that all of the surviving traditions over history are ones that implement these kind of policies, right? The ones that don't, the small tribes, they're small tribes for a reason. They were unable to go and expand, especially if you're talking like, again, thousands and thousands of years ago, because they weren't able to make the right choices. This means that they are unable and unsuccessful and are going to be outcompeted. And stuff like this can even affect big civilizations. Rome fell due to a series of negative choices, which obviously I could get into here, but I'm not going to because I want to keep this video under like 10 to 15 minutes, right? Anyways, we've learned about the anthropology of religion, birth rates, why it's economically important, and why Darwinism matters in this case. So where are we now? So we've set up the background and let's go over modern activism, right? Where is feminism now and where is the whole anti-patriarchy movement? So most people in today's world are on board with gender equality. Now the only question is to what extent. And a big part of the, I guess, the feminist literature has been abolishing the patriarchy due to its oppressive structures and impacts on women. And that's absolutely true. No one's really denying that. The only thing that you can deny, and what I'm going to make an argument for, is that there was utility in the past. And what I see a lot today is a lot of emotional arguments, right? Not really arguments based in history and why the patriarchy is outdated, but more of just saying it was bad because it was bad and it was unequal, and because it was unequal, it must be bad, right? We're completely glossing over the fact that unequal doesn't necessarily mean bad for society, and who knows, we might be wrong in 200 years. That's one of the biggest fears that you need to have. In 400 years, how are historians going to look back on today's 20th century progressive mindset and think about whatever consequences might happen in the next like 50 to 80 years? We don't know. So there are certain things that you need to consider that can't just be, oh, equality is really good and patriarchy was really oppressive and bad, and because it's bad, we don't like bad things, it should be abolished. That cannot be the only argument. So by the end of this video, right, within the next 5 to 6 minutes, we're going to discuss how you can actually improve that line of thinking into something that is more anthropologically and historically based, which makes sense and is appealing to more people because it's more logical and less emotional. So Now that we've defined what we're going to be talking about, let's go and actually explain why the patriarchy exists. So we talked about religion and birth rates, right? Social institutions that can be innovated, changed, adapted upon, and molded into what that society needs. Because as times change, as technology change, as demographics change, right? As new cultures come into your society, there are things you need to consider to make sure that your society is able to succeed, prosper, and have a positive birth rate, especially if we're talking back in the day. And the number one social institution that proliferated across I'll say it, every single society in the world is the patriarchy, right? You would assume that if equality, or not that equality was even a thing back then, but if you would assume that it's a unique phenomenon only because men are like oppressive and they're mean and stuff, that wouldn't happen. And the fact that it did get innovated across all of society of history is like the same thing as like nerve endings or brains being proliferating across all mammalian species. It just works out. Or like most species, period, right? Most more advanced animals. And the ones that had brains survived because they could actually like reason and look at their environment and see what's happening to a certain degree. And for the same reason, the proliferation of patriarchy is a very solid argument for its utility in the past. And understanding that is very crucial to understanding and criticizing it today. So why did it matter? So religion is a social institution similar to patriarchy. So you need a lot of, so if you want to have a lot of kids, let's say like if you want 3 or 4 or 5 kids to survive past age 5, where they can like live to like 40, 50, 60, which they often did after that point, you would need at least 10 births. This means a lot of time at home for the women simply spent nursing either the children or continuing to achieve pregnancies, right? There's a reason fertility was a major part of a lot of different religions back in the day, and we don't understand it today because there's no more pressure to have that many kids, but that wasn't really a thing back then, and this is kind of why. Right, so you need a system in which you can encourage women to not be independent and stay in the home, pumping out 10 babies in their lifetime, maybe, because that's really important for the society as a whole, or else you're not going to have enough children to support them in the future, and you're going to get outcompeted by neighboring tribes or neighboring states, right? That's what's going to happen. So therefore, the patriarchy was invented, wherein you can have a system in which women are going to be oppressed to a certain degree. However, for the greater good of the society and the success of that society in competition with other ones, you're going to have more children, more working hands, whether it be men or women, and therefore you're going to be more successful and outcompete your neighbors. The other part of this is that men are very, very violent and very, very energetic in their 20s to 30s, or maybe even in their teenage years, right? People like seem to get older back then much quicker. But based on this, very violence, you see the most violence and most crime-ridden demographic even today is going to be young men in their 20s, because there's a lot of unpent energy that can't really be channeled somewhere, right? Especially in the loneliness epidemic that we see today. And so society's understood this, right? There's an old African proverb that says that if you do not give the men, young men a place in the village, they will burn it down to feel its warmth, something along those lines. But it was a general understanding that you need to rein in the young men population, that way they don't go and cause havoc and tear the whole society down. So here's the thing though, like you can see a lot of productive men as well in their 20s, where they're able to channel that aggression and testosterone into something productive. And that is what the patriarchy did. That is the main utility. You're able to channel these young men into saying that if you're able to do something quality, if you're able to accomplish great things, if you're able to do good things that are good for society, then the patriarch of a woman's family will give her to you, and in return for your service to society, you will be given essentially a slave. Bad, I know, yes, today, but that worked out well. You're not only able to mitigate male crime and male aggression, you're able to divert that same aggression into productiveness. Meanwhile, you're also able to create a social institution in which women were able to give more births, thereby giving you a competitive advantage against your neighboring tribes or states. So good, we've understood that. This is why patriarchy existed, and that's why it's been innovated across every single successful society today. I'm not counting those random ass tribes that are in the middle of nowhere, because clearly they did not succeed in the same way now, right? If we wanted to, we could bang, they're all gone, right? And that's not to say that we should, but it just proves that some societies did not progress. Because here's the thing, there's no like good or bad, it's just powerful and not powerful, if you want to look at it through a Marxist lens, right? Which I'm not saying I subscribe by, but that's one way to look at it. So based on this, it makes sense why the patriarchy was innovated. However, we showed you this infant mortality rate thing earlier, right? And this shows how much improvement has been made. And there's going to be 2 arguments I'm going to be presenting that are non-emotional for why the patriarchy doesn't work now. So in the past, right, you're going to have high infant mortality rates, so you need to have 10 kids to maybe have 4 or 5 survive. Now, if you want 4 or 5 kids, you can have 4 and 5 kids, and 99% of the time, all 5 are going to survive, right? If you're unlucky, of course, it's tragic, 3 or 4, right? However, you have a lot of choice and autonomy on how many kids you want to have, and also because especially in America or in the developed countries, the whole model of like labor and we don't have a peasant society anymore, and therefore white collar labor is more valued. And having more children doesn't necessarily translate into greater gain for your family. Therefore, it doesn't really make sense to have kids either. Therefore, you don't need a social institution that enforces these two things, because you don't need women to have 10 kids anymore. They can just have 1 or 2 if they need, right? 1, 2, 3. 4, right? And they could choose to have that many, therefore giving women more time and freedom. In addition, having more kids isn't necessary to have a, this is more recent, obviously, like maybe last 20, 30 years, 40, 50, 60, I don't know, past 1950, let's say. After industrialization and the invention of the white-collar market, you don't really need more kids to have a successful economy, right? So therefore, that is solved as well. And that is the main reason I'm trying to preach here. Instead of going for an emotional argument on why this is bad and how bad things shouldn't be encouraged, there is a real argument for why the patriarchy isn't applicable in today's world, even though it was in the past. However, we are seeing the clear negatives of this, right? We're seeing that birth rates are dropping to scary amounts. And as I said earlier, if birth rates drop to a scarily low amount, you're going to lose out, because you're going to have social inequality, you're going to have lack of social cohesion, possible revolution. Because here's the thing: the bigger each previous generation gets, the more burden the following one will have to have, right? If I need to support the millennials, if I need to support Gen X, right, as a Gen Z, I will need to do X amount of work. We are small. Are we smaller? All right, I actually don't know that, but okay. Let's just say, for example, the boomers are bigger than Gen Z, right? I don't know if they are, maybe. So we have to do X amount of work to support the boomer generation. However, the generation after Alpha, whatever the hell it's called right now, they're going to need to do even more work, because currently they're going to be smaller than every other generation before it, because the birth rates are dropping rapidly. This means that every individual in the one after Gen Alpha, or I guess Gen Alpha itself, will need to do more work than Gen Z had to do to support the boomers, right? And what that will really go to show is that there's a lot to be lost when it comes to declining population rates. There's a lot to happen. There's a lot of problems inherent in that system. So for both sides, there are really compelling arguments to make about the patriarchy and about social institutions that aren't based in emotion, that aren't based simply in tradition. Because here's the thing: if you're a feminist, if you don't like the patriarchy, I think it's gone by now, in all honesty, especially with the way things are going right now, where you have like free sex, and fathers don't marry off their daughters, all these very basic things that have been innovated, right? Because we don't need it anymore. You can still go for an emotional argument. You should not, though. There are genuine arguments for why the patriarchy does not need to exist anymore. Medical and infrastructure advancements have made it so white-collar jobs eliminates the need for more children for economic support, and infant mortality rates have dropped so low that you don't need 10 pregnancies in your lifetime to have 3 or 4 kids survive. Which is also probably like really mentally taxing at that point, like seeing your kids die over and over again. And you also, and if you're on the other side where you want the patriarchy or some semblance of a male-dominated society to proliferate, or at least some traditional norms to be preserved, you cannot make the argument that just because it's tradition, it's been tried and tested over history, that it's valid. Understanding why those things were applicable in history are important, and then understanding why it's not today is equally important. So even if you're conservative and if you're history-based, you really cannot make the argument anymore that patriarchy makes sense. Even though traditions are good, and then traditions have had, of course, a bevy of other like social outflows, right? For example, like the patriarchy also had one of the major like aspects of it was prudery, which we do not have anymore, right? We have a very sex-free society, which might be something that we might regret in the future, but we don't know. There's a lot of things that might be influenced, but the very fact of patriarchy doesn't make sense anymore, simply due to the anthropological reasons of the past and how it doesn't really translate to today. Okay, wow, I talked insane amount there. I apologize for any loud noises. But if you want to learn more about this, leave a comment, tell me what you think. But this is really, yeah. If you have any comments, criticisms, questions, concerns, or any further discussion points, comment section down below. I will be very good about, in this video, responding to comments. Thank you, and it's been Rhetoric Reviewed, out.